little one. I don't believe this.
What kind of child refuses 6 governesses in a row, yet runs without a single moment of hesitation into the arms of a stranger in a plain wool cloak? And what does it say about a grand house when the only person a grieving little girl trusts is the one woman the family calls unsuitable? Snow was still falling over Ravenhollow Estate the morning the 6th governess arrived, and by noon she was gone, her trunk dragged back down the front steps by 2 footmen while she wept into a handkerchief and swore she would never set foot past those iron gates again. 7-year-old Wren Thorne had not screamed. She had not thrown anything. She had simply stood at the top of the great staircase, silent as she had been for 11 months, and stared at the woman until the woman broke on her own. That was how Wren won. She did not fight. She waited, and in the cold, echoing halls of her uncle's house, waiting had become the only language she had left. Duke Alaric Thorne watched from his study window as the carriage rolled away, and he pressed 2 fingers to his temple, because in 3 days the estate board would meet, and if his niece did not have a guardian by then, custody of the only family he had left would pass to strangers in London. He had buried his brother. He would not bury this too. Before we step into the manor, into the ballrooms and the secrets buried beneath its floors, subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going, and how far we'll go together. The Duke did not raise his voice. He never had to. Every servant at Ravenhollow understood that Alaric Thorne's temper lived in stillness, not shouting, and the stillness in the drawing room that afternoon was heavier than any storm rolling off the moors. He stood by the fireplace with his hands folded behind his back, watching the last governess's carriage disappear down the long gravel drive, and behind him Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, wrung her apron between her fingers as though she could wring calm out of the fabric itself. "She lasted 4 hours, Your Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. "Longer than the last one, at least. That is not a comfort." Alaric turned. His face was carved from the same cold discipline that had run through 3 generations of Thorne men. A strong jaw, a mouth that rarely softened, eyes the gray of a winter sea that had learned long ago never to show a wave. "The board convenes in 3 days. If Wren has no governess by then, they will say I cannot manage my own household, and they will hand her guardianship to the Chancery Court." "The child does not need managing, sir." Mrs. Pemberton's voice trembled, but she held her ground, because she had known Wren since the girl could barely walk, since before grief had folded the little girl in on herself like a letter no one dared open again. "She needs someone who will sit with her silence instead of trying to talk over it." Alaric said nothing to that. There was nothing to say that would not sound like an excuse, and Thorne men did not make excuses, not even to themselves. He walked past the housekeeper, up the long staircase, past the portraits of ancestors who had never once, in his memory, looked kind, past the tall windows where the winter light fell thin and gray across the floor, and stopped outside the nursery door. He did not go in. He simply stood there, listening to nothing, because there was nothing to hear. His niece had not spoken a single word since the accident that took her parents 11 months ago, and every physician he had summoned from London had given him the same useless answer. Time, patience, time. He did not have time. He had a board meeting circled in red ink on his desk calendar, a family name that had survived 2 centuries without a single public scandal, and a little girl on the other side of a door who flinched whenever he came too close, as though his very presence reminded her of everything she had lost. Inside the nursery, Wren sat on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest, a wooden horse abandoned beside her, staring at nothing in particular. She had heard the carriage leave. She always heard them leave. 6 women in 6 months, each one arriving with a bright, brittle smile and a leather case full of grammar primers, each one departing in tears within a day, sometimes within an hour. Wren did not remember deciding to frighten them away. She only remembered that every time one of them reached for her hand, or spoke to her in that high, sing-song voice adults used for children they had already decided were broken, something in her chest closed like a fist, and the closing felt safer than the alternative. She had not chosen silence. Silence had simply been the last solid thing left standing after the carriage crash that took her mother and father, and she clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood, not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only thing that had not yet been taken from her. That night, alone in his study with a glass of brandy he did not drink, Alaric turned the day over in his mind the way he turned over a bad harvest report, looking for the single line that had gone wrong. He thought of his brother, Edmund, who had always known how to make Wren laugh, who used to carry her on his shoulders through the orchard while their mother, long dead herself, would have scolded them both for ruining a good coat. Edmund had been warm in every way Alaric was not, and now Edmund was gone, and his daughter had inherited none of his ease and all of Alaric's own guarded silence, as though grief itself had chosen the crueler inheritance. He made a decision that went against every instinct bred into him since birth. If the daughters of earls and the polished graduates of London finishing schools could not reach his niece, he would look somewhere no thorn had ever thought to look before. He rang for his steward before he could talk himself out of it. "Have my horse saddled at first light," he said. "I am riding to the village." The steward blinked. "Millbrook, your grace? Might I ask what business?" "You may not," Alaric said, and turned back to the window, where the snow had begun again, soft and relentless, settling over the grounds like a held breath. He did not sleep that night. He sat instead with a small portrait of his brother propped against the inkwell on his desk, Edmund's painted smile warm even in oil and canvas, and he found himself speaking aloud to it, quietly, as he had not done since the funeral. "I do not know how you did it," he said to the portrait, laughing. "Patience. You made it look so easy, and I have made a mess of the one thing you left me to protect." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I will find her someone, Edmund. I do not know who yet. But I will not let the board take her to London to be raised by strangers who never once heard her laugh the way you could make her laugh." Down the hall, unseen, Wren sat awake in her bed with her wooden horse clutched to her chest, listening to the wind against the window pane, and did not cry, because she had long since run out of tears, and instead simply waited, the way she waited for everything now, for whatever came next. At breakfast the next morning, Lady Constance arrived unannounced, as she so often did, settling into a chair across from Alaric with the ease of someone who considered the house half her own. "I heard you turned away yet another governess," she said, buttering her toast without looking up. "Mrs. Ashworth's daughter, was it? Fine family. The Ashworths will not soon forget the insult." The insult, if there was one, belonged to my niece, who did not ask to be paraded before 6 strangers in as many months. Alaric's voice was even, but his hand tightened slightly around his cup. "The board will not see it that way. They will see a duke who cannot govern his own household, and they will use that to justify exactly the kind of interference you claim to fear." Constance set down her knife with deliberate precision. "You have 3 days, Alaric. I would think carefully before you do anything rash." "I am always careful," he said. "It is the one lesson our family never let me forget." She studied him for a moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then she smiled, thin and practiced. "Good. Then you will understand why I only ever act in this family's best interest." Alaric did not answer. He only rose, set down his napkin, and left the table, already thinking of the road to Millbrook, of the stone bridge, of a plan he could not yet fully explain even to himself. The village of Millbrook sat 2 miles past Ravenhollow's gates, close enough that its church bells could be heard from the estate on a still morning, and far enough that no thorn had walked its streets in a generation. Alaric rode there alone, without his usual retinue, wearing a plain gray coat instead of his ducal colors, because he did not want the village staring at him any more than it already would, and because some private, unexamined part of him did not want to be recognized at all, not yet, not until he understood what he was looking for. The lane past the stone bridge smelled of wood smoke and wet hay. Children ran barefoot despite the cold, chasing a loose chicken past a row of low cottages, and an old man tipped his cap to Alaric without quite meeting his eyes, the way villagers had learned to greet gentry politely, and from a careful distance. He found her by accident, or by whatever force governs the accidents that change a life. Naomi Fairweather sat outside her small cottage near the stone bridge, a basket of mending at her feet, a needle moving through pale linen with the kind of patience that came only from years of practice and very little else to fall back on. She hummed under her breath, low and unhurried, some old tune Alaric half recognized from his own childhood nursery. And when the children ran past chasing their chicken, she looked up, laughed a real laugh, warm and unguarded, entirely unlike the careful, measured laughter of the drawing rooms he knew, and called out a gentle warning about the well being iced over. Alaric stopped his horse at the edge of the lane and watched her longer than he intended to. She was not beautiful in the way court portraits painted beauty. Her brown hair had come loose from its pins, wisps curling around a face that had clearly known hardship, a widow's gray dress, patched at the elbow, work-roughened hands, the quiet exhaustion of someone who had buried a husband young and simply kept going, because stopping was not a privilege afforded to widows with rent to pay. And yet there was something in the way she held herself, straight-backed even while sitting on a low stool in the cold, that struck him harder than any jewel he had ever seen glittering at Lady Constance's throat. He dismounted. She looked up at him with open curiosity, no fear, no simpering courtesy, simply a level, appraising gaze that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You're lost, sir," she said, not a question. "I am looking for someone who is good with children who do not wish to be reached." Naomi set her needle down, considering him properly now, the fine cut of his coat despite its plainness, the way he stood as though a great deal rested permanently on his shoulders. "Every child wishes to be reached," she said. "Most of us simply knock on the wrong door, and then decide the fault lies with the child instead of the knocking." Alaric did not know why those words settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending small ripples through places he had thought long since sealed over. "You speak plainly," he said. "I have found it saves time." Faint smile. "Who is the child, sir, if I may ask?" "My niece. She has not spoken in 11 months. He said it more bluntly than he meant to, and something in Naomi's expression softened at once, the appraisal giving way to something gentler. "And how many have tried to reach her?" 6 governesses. 3 physicians. None of them lasted longer than an afternoon. "Then perhaps," Naomi said, folding her mending into her lap, "they were trying to teach her, sir, when what she needs is someone willing simply to sit beside her and wait." She studied him a moment longer. "You are the Duke of Ravenhollow." It was not a question either, and Alaric found he did not mind being seen so plainly, so entirely without the deference that usually blunted every conversation he had. "I am. And you have ridden 2 miles from your estate, in a coat that does not suit you, to ask a village widow for help with your money and your title." Naomi rose, brushing off her skirt. "That is either very foolish or very brave. I have not decided which." "Perhaps it is only desperate," Alaric admitted, and the honesty of it surprised him even as he said it. Naomi held his gaze a moment longer, weighing something he could not read, and then she reached for her shawl. "Show me the child," she said simply. "I will make no promises beyond that." They walked together toward the estate, Alaric leading his horse by the reins rather than riding ahead of her, an unconscious courtesy that did not go unnoticed. Along the way, villagers paused in their doorways, watching the unlikely pair pass the Duke of Ravenhollow, on foot, beside the widow Fairweather, whose husband had died of a fever 3 winters past and left her with little more than a cottage and a reputation for honest work. "You will hear things about me, once you are inside those gates," Alaric said, breaking the silence as they neared the stone bridge. "That I am cold, difficult, that I buried my own grief so deep after my brother's death, that I forgot how to comfort a child who needed comforting. I do not put much stock in things I am told about a person," Naomi replied. "I prefer to watch what they do." "And what have you watched me do, in the space of one conversation?" She considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. "I have watched you admit you do not have the answers instead of pretending you do. That is rarer in gentlemen than you might think, your grace." A faint smile touched her mouth. "It is not nothing." Alaric found himself, unexpectedly, smiling back a small thing, barely there, but real, the first genuine smile to cross his face in longer than he could easily recall. At the estate gates, the iron bars rising tall and black against the gray sky, Naomi paused a moment before stepping through them. Glancing back once toward the village she had never left for longer than a market day in all her life. "Whatever happens beyond these gates," Alaric said, watching her hesitate. You owe this family nothing. If it does not suit you, if Wren does not take to you, you are free to walk back to that cottage any hour you choose. I will not trap you here out of desperation. I am not so easily trapped, Your Grace, Naomi said, some of her earlier steadiness returning. I have raised myself out of harder places than a cold house with a grieving child in it. I am not afraid of silence. I have lived inside on my own for 3 years now, since my husband passed. I only hope I might be of some use to a girl who has learned the same lesson far too young. He held the gate open for her, and together they walked the long drive toward the manor, past bare oaks and frozen fountains, toward whatever waited on the other side. Lady Constance Vale arrived at Ravenhollow the moment she heard a village widow had been brought through the front doors, and her disapproval filled the drawing-room before she had even removed her gloves. A seamstress, Alaric. She said the word as though it dirted her mouth, turning it over with visible distaste. In this house, have you lost your senses entirely? What will the board say when they hear you've filled the nursery with a woman who mends other people's petticoats for coins? I have lost patience with governesses who cannot last a single afternoon, Alaric said flatly, refusing to look away from her. This is a trial. Nothing more. A trial. Lady Constance's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. How very convenient that your trial happens to have a pretty face. Constance. I am only saying what the whole county will say the moment word travels past these walls. She smoothed her burgundy skirts, composed again, dangerous in her composure. You have a duty to this family's name, Alaric. Edmund would not have wanted. Do not, Alaric said, low and final, invoke my brother to win an argument about my niece. Naomi stood near the window through all of it, aware of every eye in the room, aware that she did not belong among the silk and gold leaf, and yet she did not shrink. She had been poor her whole life. She knew how to be looked down upon and keep her spine straight anyway. Her late husband used to say she had a backbone stubborn enough to shame a mule, and he had meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. It was Wren who decided the matter in the end, the way children so often decide the things adults spend hours arguing over. The little girl appeared in the doorway in her black morning dress, thin and pale, her eyes far too old for a face so young. She looked at the room full of adults who had come to discuss her future as though she were a problem to be solved. A leaking roof, a disputed hedgerow, and then her gaze landed on Naomi, and something in her small shoulders eased, the way a held breath finally let go. She crossed the Persian rug without a sound, past her uncle, past Lady Constance's outstretched, startled hand, and wrapped both arms around Naomi's waist, pressing her face into the plain wool skirt as though she had finally, after 11 months, found somewhere safe to stand still. No one in the room spoke. Lady Constance's mouth had gone thin and white. Alaric stared at his niece at the first willing touch she had offered anyone since the funeral, at the small fingers curling into fistfuls of gray wool, as though she meant never to let go, and felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent years keeping sealed shut with duty and cold water and the certainty that feeling things led only to losing them. Naomi knelt slowly, so as not to startle the girl, and simply rested one hand against Wren's back, saying nothing at all, asking for nothing, offering only the plain fact of her presence. She stays, Alaric said quietly, and it was not a request. Lady Constance's eyes moved from the child to the widow to the duke, cataloging something in the silence, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft and careful in a way that unsettled Naomi far more than the sharpness before it had. How touching, she murmured. We shall see how long it lasts. She swept from the room in a rustle of burgundy silk, and the moment the door closed behind her, the tension in the drawing-room seemed to exhale all at once. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been hovering near the hallway throughout the entire exchange, pressed a hand to her chest and let out a small, disbelieving laugh. 11 months, she said softly, watching Wren still clinging to Naomi's skirt. 11 months I have prayed to see that child reach for someone the way she just reached for you, Miss Fairweather. Naomi knelt fully now, gathering Wren gently into her arms, feeling the small body finally begin to relax against her. You did not have to say a word to convince me to help you, she murmured into the girl's dark curls. You only had to ask in your own way. And you did. Alaric watched the two of them from across the room, and for the first time since his brother's funeral, he allowed himself to hope cautiously, guardedly, the way a man tests ice before trusting his full weight to it, that something in his household might finally begin to heal. Naomi's room was small, tucked near the nursery, plain compared to the guest quarters down the hall, and she did not mind at all. She had grown up sleeping in rooms smaller than this one, and there was a strange comfort in a bed that did not dwarf her. What she minded was the house itself. Ravenhollow seemed to hold its breath at night, the long corridors stretching further in darkness than they had any right to, and the servants lowered their voices near the east staircase in a way that made the hair rise on the back of Naomi's neck, though none of them would say why. On her third night, she woke to the soft glow of a candle passing her door and found Mrs. Pemberton in the corridor, wrapped in a shawl, her face drawn with a worry that had nothing to do with the hour. "You should not wander this house after dark, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Not until you understand it better." "Understand what?" Naomi drew her own shawl tighter, following the older woman a few steps down the darkened hall. The housekeeper hesitated, glancing behind her as though the walls themselves might be listening, might carry word back to someone she feared. The old Duke Wren's father did not simply fall ill and pass, whatever the family tells the village. There were things said before he died. Things I was told never to repeat, by people with far more power than an old housekeeper has to refuse them. She shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter still, as though the memory itself carried a draft. "Watch the child closely, Miss Fairweather. Watch who comes near her, and watch what she draws when she thinks no one is looking." Naomi carried those words with her the following morning, when she found Wren sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor, drawing the same picture over and over on scraps of paper she then hid beneath a loose floorboard. A woman in a dark red dress, standing beside a teacup, always beside a teacup, the cup rendered in careful, obsessive detail while the woman's face remained a blank oval, unfinished, as though Wren could not bring herself to draw it in full. "Who is that?" Naomi asked gently, sitting on the floor beside her, careful to keep her voice light, unthreatening, the way she might approach a spooked animal. Wren's pencil stopped. She looked at Naomi for a long moment, something working behind her eyes, and then she simply pushed the paper away and reached instead for her wooden horse, the silence closing over her again like water over a dropped stone. Naomi did not press. She had learned, in 3 short days, that pressing only drove Wren further into herself, and so she picked up a needle instead and began stitching a small square of fabric, humming the same tune she had hummed by her cottage window, letting the silence between them fill with something other than fear. Slowly, without seeming to decide to, Wren edged closer, until her small shoulder rested against Naomi's arm, watching the needle move. Downstairs, in his study, Alaric was fighting a battle of his own. Lady Constance stood over his desk uninvited. Her voice dropped to something sharp and private, meant only for him. "A village widow cannot raise a future duchess's household," she hissed. "People will talk, Alaric. They already are. I have had 2 letters this week alone, asking whether the rumors are true. Let them talk." He did not look up from his ledgers, though his pen had stopped moving some minutes ago. "I have spent 11 months watching physicians and governesses fail my niece. I will not apologize for trying something that is working." Working. Constance's laugh was brittle. She hugged a servant in front of the household staff. "That is not healing, Alaric. That is scandal wearing a kind face." But his eyes kept drifting, without his permission, to the window that overlooked the garden where Naomi and Wren now sat together in the pale winter sun, the little girl's head resting against a shoulder that had somehow, in a matter of days, become the safest place in the entire house. He watched them a moment too long, and Lady Constance watched him watching, and something in her expression curdled into calculation before she gathered her skirts and left without another word. That afternoon, Naomi took Wren on a short walk through the estate's kitchen garden, past frostbitten cabbage rows and bare apple trees, teaching her the names of herbs still hardy enough to survive the cold. Rosemary, sage, the last stubborn sprigs of thyme. Wren did not speak, but she pointed and pulled at Naomi's sleeve when something caught her interest, and once, when a robin landed on the garden wall and cocked its head at them, She let out a small, surprised laugh before catching herself and pressing her lips shut again, as though laughter itself were something forbidden. Naomi did not make a fuss of it. She only smiled and said, "He liked making you laugh. I think he'll come back tomorrow to try again," and kept walking, letting the moment settle naturally instead of pinning it down with attention it could not survive. From the terrace above, Mrs. Pemberton watched them both, and thought, not for the first time, that this quiet widow with mud on her boots had done in a fortnight what an army of physicians and governesses had failed to do in nearly a year. She had simply treated the child like a child again, instead of a grief to be managed. By the second week, Wren had begun to draw pictures instead of sitting frozen, and to hum along under her breath when Naomi sang while stitching. It was not speech, not yet, but it was more life than the household had seen in nearly a year, and even the sternest of the staff found themselves smiling when they passed the nursery door and heard, faintly, the sound of a child's hum threading through the old stone halls. Alaric began joining the evening lessons under the excuse of overseeing them, though everyone in the house, including him, knew that was not the real reason. He found himself lingering in the library long after the ledgers were closed, watching Naomi help Wren sound out simple words on a slate, watching the patient way she never once raised her voice, never once showed the exhaustion he knew she must feel after a full day of coaxing warmth out of stone. "You are good with her," he said one evening, standing in the doorway longer than he needed to. "I am patient with her," Naomi corrected, not looking up from the slate. "There is a difference. Goodness comes naturally to some people. Patience is only a decision you make again every single morning, whether you feel like making it or not." "And do you feel like making it?" "Every morning." Naomi considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "Not every morning, but I made it anyway. I think that matters more than the feeling does." Alaric found he had no answer to that, only the growing, unwelcome awareness that he wanted to sit down across from her and keep talking long after Wren had been put to bed. One evening, reviewing the household accounts together, Naomi had offered, gently, to help organize the receipts that had piled up since the old Duke's death, since Alaric himself had little patience for figures and less time. She paused over a column and frowned, tracing the entry with one finger. "This," she said, turning the ledger toward him. "Repairs to the east wing roof. Paid twice, a month apart to two different names." Alaric leaned over her shoulder, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair, close enough that his voice came out lower than he intended. "Show me." Naomi's finger traced down the page. There were more small sums, easy to miss individually, but together forming a pattern of money quietly leaving the estate through invoices that did not match any actual repairs anyone on staff could recall being made. And every discrepancy traced back to approval signed in Lady Constance's careful, looping hand. "She has access to the household accounts," Naomi said carefully, "because she manages them while you attend to the larger estate matters. That is what your steward told me when I asked who kept the books before I arrived." Alaric's jaw tightened. He said nothing for a long moment, staring at the numbers that suggested his cousin by marriage had been quietly bleeding his family's fortune for longer than he cared to imagine. When he finally looked up, it was not at the ledger, but at Naomi, at the steady, unflinching way she had simply told him the truth instead of softening it for his comfort. The way every courtier and cousin in his life had always softened everything until it became unrecognizable. "No one has spoken plainly to me in years," he said quietly. "Not since my brother died. Everyone around me measures their words as carefully as they measure their curtsies." "Then perhaps," Naomi answered, meeting his eyes without flinching, "you have been surrounded by the wrong people, Your Grace." "Alaric," he said, "if we are to speak plainly, you might as well use my name." Something passed between them then, quiet and unhurried, and neither of them reached for the ledger again for a long moment. Later that evening, after Wren had been put to bed with a story half told and a promise to finish it tomorrow, Alaric found himself lingering in the library rather than retiring to his own wing. Naomi sat by the fire mending one of Wren's dresses, the hem torn from an afternoon spent climbing the low garden wall, and he took the chair across from her without quite deciding to. "May I ask you something?" he said. "That has nothing to do with ledgers or thieves or my niece?" Naomi glanced up, amused. That would be a first for this house. Why sewing? You could have found other work in the village. Cooking, perhaps, or laundering. My mother was a seamstress. Her mother before her. Naomi's needle moved steady and sure through the fabric. There is something honest about mending, Alaric. You take something broken, and instead of pretending it was never torn, you stitch the tear closed so carefully that it becomes part of the garment's history instead of its ruin. I find I would rather do that with cloth than with anything else. He watched her for a long moment, firelight catching the loose strands of her hair. I think, he said slowly, you have been doing rather more mending in this house than you realize. Naomi's hands stilled over the fabric, and she did not look up, though a small, private smile touched her mouth before she bent back to her work. Lady Constance hosted an afternoon tea in the east parlor, insisting it was time the household returned to proper order. And though Alaric suspected her motives, he allowed it, if only to keep the peace before the board's arrival in a matter of days. Wren sat beside Naomi, quieter than usual, watching the room with the wary stillness of a child who trusted very few people in it and had learned, young and hard, exactly why that wariness kept her safe. When a servant set a cup before her, sweetened the way Wren liked it, the girl reached for it without thinking, her small fingers curling around the porcelain. Naomi's hand shot out and closed around the cup before it reached Wren's lips. It was instinct more than certainty, but something in the pale, faintly bitter smell rising from the tea made every nerve in her body go cold. She had spent years around the herb garden behind her own cottage, had nursed her dying husband through his final illness with tinctures and teas of her own careful making, and she knew the smell of foxglove leaves steeped too long. She knew it did not belong anywhere near a child's cup. Wren, love, wait one moment, she said gently, keeping her voice light even as her pulse hammered against her ribs. Lady Constance's composure did not so much as flicker. Whatever is the matter, Mrs. Fairweather? It is only tea. Then you will not mind if I taste it first? Naomi said, and watched carefully, as something behind Lady Constance's eyes went very still and very cold before smoothing back into practiced boredom, like a lake refreezing over a crack. How dramatic, Constance said lightly, waving a hand for the tray to be taken away. Perhaps the kitchen has used old leaves. I shall have a word with cook. Alaric, who had watched the entire exchange from across the room, crossed to Naomi's side the moment the tea had been removed, his voice low. What did you smell? Foxglove? Naomi murmured, so only he could hear. Steeped too long to be an accident of stale leaves. I have used it myself, Alaric, sparingly, for a weak heart. In the wrong measure, it does not weaken a heart. It stops one. Alaric's face went the color of old ash. He looked across the room to where Lady Constance sat sipping her own cup with perfect composure, and something in him, some last reluctance to believe the worst of family, finally gave way entirely. Later, alone in the herb garden, Naomi found a lace handkerchief caught on a rosebush near the kitchen door, monogrammed with a familiar looping initial, smelling faintly of the same bitter herb. She did not confront anyone. She simply folded it carefully into her pocket, her hands trembling only slightly, and understood, with a certainty that frightened her more than she let herself admit, that whatever had truly happened to Wren's parents had not finished happening yet. The danger in this house had only paused, waiting for its next quiet opportunity. That night she sat by Wren's bed long after the girl had fallen asleep, watching the small chest rise and fall, and made a silent promise that whatever else happened, whatever the board decided, whatever Lady Constance tried next, she would not leave this child unwatched again. Alaric found her there near midnight, still sitting in the low chair beside the bed, the handkerchief folded in her lap. He did not speak at first, only stood in the doorway watching her watch his niece sleep, and something in the sight of it, this woman who owed his family nothing, guarding his brother's daughter as though she were her own, settled a decision in him that he had been circling for days. I am going to write to a solicitor in the city tomorrow, he said quietly, stepping into the room. About Constance. About the accounts. I should have done it the moment you first showed me those numbers. You were protecting your family, Naomi said. I do not fault you for that, even when the person you are protecting does not deserve it. She is not protecting anyone but herself. Alaric's jaw tightened. I have spent a year telling myself grief made me imagine slights that were not there. I do not think I imagined this. Naomi rose from the chair, tucking the handkerchief into her sleeve. Then do not wait any longer than you must, she said. Whatever she tried tonight, I do not think it will be the last thing she tries. She was right, though neither of them yet knew how soon, or how far, Lady Constance was prepared to go. The confrontation at the tea table left Naomi shaken in a way she did not want Wren to see, so that evening, once the girl was settled with Mrs. Pemberton and a plate of biscuits, Naomi walked out to the old stone stables at the edge of the garden, needing air, needing quiet, needing a moment where she did not have to be strong for anyone but herself. The sky broke open before she made it back. Rain came down in cold, heavy sheets, drumming against the cobblestones, and she ducked beneath the stable stone archway just as Alaric came riding in from the far pasture, equally soaked, equally startled to find her there, his horse's breath fogging in the sudden chill. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain hammered the cobblestones and ran in silver ropes off the eaves. A lantern hanging from the archway swayed on its hook and threw shifting gold light across both their faces, softening the hard lines that duty had carved into his and the tiredness that grief had carved into hers. You should not be out here alone, Alaric said finally, dismounting, leading his horse beneath the shelter, though his voice had none of the coldness it carried in front of the household. Neither should you. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, and she was surprised when he shrugged out of his sodden riding coat and settled it over her shoulders without a word, without ceremony, as though it cost him nothing, though she suspected, watching the set of his jaw, that it cost him a great deal to offer anything so simply. I was 7 when my father told me a duke does not need comfort, Alaric said quietly, staring out at the rain instead of at her, his voice dropping into something she had not heard from him before, unguarded, almost young. That warmth was for weaker men, for tenant farmers and their wives, not for a family that had to hold an entire county together through its own iron will. I believed him for 20 years. I built my whole life around believing him. And now a woman with mud on her hem and thread under her fingernails walked into my house and made my niece speak with her eyes again, when nothing else could. He turned to face her fully. And I do not know what to believe anymore. I only know that I have not slept well since you arrived, and it is not because of worry. Naomi looked up at him, and the space between them had grown very small without either of them deciding it should. You do not have to be cold to be strong, she said softly. I think you learned the wrong lesson from a frightened man who mistook silence for strength his whole life, and passed the mistake down to you like an inheritance. His hand rose, gentle, to brush a raindrop from her cheek, his fingers lingering a moment longer than they needed to. You are not at all what I expected to find beyond that stone bridge, he murmured. What did you expect? I hardly know. Someone ordinary, perhaps. Instead, I found someone who reads a household's secrets in a column of numbers, and smells poison in a teacup before anyone else in the room even thinks to be afraid. His voice softened further. I find I am no longer certain how I managed before you came. For one suspended moment neither of them moved, the air between them warm despite the storm, his hand still resting against her cheek. Her breath caught somewhere between fear and want, and then a flash of lightning lit the garden, and both of them saw, at the same instant, a shape retreating from the balcony above the stable yard, someone who had been watching, and was gone before either of them could call out into the rain. Alaric's hand dropped. The warmth of the moment shattered into something colder, more watchful. Constance, he said, not a question. We should go inside, Naomi said quietly, though her heart was still hammering from more than fear alone. Whatever she saw, we will not settle it standing in the rain. They walked back to the house slowly, close together beneath the shelter of his coat, the storm easing to a soft, steady patter by the time the lit windows of Ravenhollow came into view. Neither of them spoke of what had almost happened beneath the archway, though both of them carried it, quiet and unresolved, the rest of the way home. I have not felt like this in a very long time, Alaric admitted finally, at the base of the servants' stair where they would part ways for the night. I am not entirely certain what to do with it. You do not have to do anything with it tonight, Naomi said gently. Some things are allowed to simply exist for a while, before they become decisions. He nodded slowly, and for a moment his hand found hers in the dark, a brief, warm pressure before he let go. "Good night, Naomi." "Good night, Your Grace." "Alaric," he corrected, and she was smiling as she climbed the stairs to check on Wren one last time before bed. 3 days before the board meeting, an accusation arrived like a blade dropped without warning. Lady Constance stood in the great hall with 2 estate officials beside her and demanded, in a voice pitched to carry through every corridor, that Naomi's belongings be searched immediately, before breakfast had even been cleared away. She claimed a family necklace had gone missing from the vault 2 nights prior, and that certain new additions to the household bore watching, given how conveniently the timing aligned. Naomi's sewing chest was opened in front of the assembled staff, every servant summoned to witness what Lady Constance clearly intended as a public reckoning. And there, nestled beneath a half-finished christening gown Naomi had been stitching for a village friend's newborn, lay a diamond necklace that had belonged to Wren's late mother. The hall went silent. Naomi felt the blood drain from her face, not from guilt, but from the sick, plummeting understanding of exactly how thoroughly she had been set up, and how little proof she had to counter it. "I have never touched that necklace," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest like something alive. "I did not put it there, and I do not know how it came to be in my chest." "The law does not concern itself with your protests, Mrs. Fairweather," Lady Constance said, and for the first time, something like triumph slipped through her composure, bright and unmistakable. "It concerns itself with what was found, and where it was found." Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Your Grace, I have known this woman only a fortnight, but I have known thieves in my time, and I have never seen one weep in front of the household staff for a child that isn't her own the way this woman has." "Sentiment?" Lady Constance said, waving the housekeeper's words away like smoke. "Is not evidence, Mrs. Pemberton. Perhaps you would like to explain to the magistrate why the servants' quarters harbor such loyalty to a suspected thief." Alaric stood at the top of the hall, torn between the family charter that bound him to report the theft to the magistrate within a fixed number of hours, and the growing, undeniable certainty that the woman in front of him was not a thief, that she had never been anything but honest with him since the day he found her stitching gold thread by a cottage window, since the day she had told him plainly that he had learned the wrong lesson from a frightened man. He thought of the ledger. He thought of the foxglove. He thought of the shape retreating from the balcony in the rain. "Take her to the west sitting room," he said finally, his voice tight with the effort of keeping it level. "No one touches the magistrate until I have spoken with her alone, and reviewed the household accounts myself." "Alaric, the charter is clear." "The charter," Alaric said, turning on his cousin with a coldness that made even the estate officials shift uncomfortably, "does not require me to act on the word of the last person who happened to be in this room before the necklace disappeared and mysteriously reappeared in exactly the place most convenient for accusation." It was not an acquittal, but it was, for the first time, Alaric choosing to doubt his cousin instead of the woman his niece had chosen to trust. And Lady Constance's carefully composed smile faltered just enough, for just long enough, that Naomi saw the crack beneath it. She saw, for one unguarded instant, the fear of a woman whose plan had not gone quite the way she intended. In the west sitting room, alone with Naomi at last, Alaric paced before the fire, fury and fear warring plainly across his face for the first time since she had known him. "I should have sent her from this house the day you found the discrepancies in the ledger," he said. "I let family obligations cloud judgment I should have trusted from the start." "You could not have known she would go this far," Naomi said, though her hands, folded tightly in her lap, betrayed how badly the morning's events had shaken her. "I should have known regardless." He stopped pacing, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. "I am asking you to stay, Naomi, not only for Wren's sake now, but because I do not know how to imagine this house, or my own life inside it, without you in it any longer. I know this is not the moment for such a confession. I do not care. I have spent too many days already saying nothing when I meant to say everything." Naomi's breath caught. "Alaric, the board meets in 2 days. There is a magistrate involved. A necklace. If this goes badly, Then it goes badly with you beside me, not banished from this house on a lie. His hand covered hers. I am done being careful with everything except the one thing that has ever mattered. She did not pull away. The estate's winter ball went ahead as planned, because canceling it on the eve of the board meeting would have raised more questions than Lady Constance was prepared to answer, and because she intended to use the gathered crowd of witnesses to finish, publicly and irreversibly, what the necklace had started. Naomi stood at the edge of the ballroom in a borrowed cream gown. Watching candlelight glitter across chandeliers, she still did not feel she belonged beneath. Aware of the whispers that followed her across the polished floor, aware of every titled eye that found her and lingered with open curiosity or open disdain. Alaric had asked her, quietly, whether she wished to stay upstairs instead. She had refused. She would not give Lady Constance the satisfaction of watching her hide. Halfway through the evening, as the orchestra paused between sets, Lady Constance rose before the assembled guests and declared, loudly enough for every titled ear in the room to catch, that the household's new companion was a thief who had wormed her way into a grieving family's trust, and that the Duke's judgment had been clouded by grief and, she added with a pointed glance, by rather more than grief alone. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a delighted, scandalized murmur spreading from gown to gown. And then, from the top of the great staircase, came something no one in that house had heard in 11 months. She is lying. Wren's voice, small and cracked from disuse, rang out over the stunned silence of the ballroom, thin as a reed but carrying, impossibly, to every corner of the hall. She descended the stairs clutching a worn ledger to her chest, one she had found weeks earlier, hidden behind a loose panel in the library while playing a game of hide-and-seek with herself, one whose numbers Naomi had unknowingly taught her to read during quiet afternoons on the nursery floor. Every head in the ballroom turned. Alaric moved toward his niece without thinking, his heart in his throat, but Wren did not falter, did not run to him. She walked instead the rest of the way down the stairs on her own, her chin lifted the way she had seen Naomi's chin lift 100 times in the past 2 weeks. I heard her, Wren said, her voice shaking but growing steadier with every word, tears streaking her pale face. The night Papa got sick. I heard her talking about the tea, about the deed to the Northfields, about making sure Papa never woke up. I didn't tell anyone because I was scared she'd do it to me too, if she knew I heard. The room erupted into chaos exactly as smoke began curling from beneath the doors of the lower west corridor. A candle left burning too near old drapery, whether by accident or design, no one would ever be entirely certain, had caught, and within moments the smell of fire chased the scent of orange blossom and wine through the hall, sending guests scrambling for the exits in a rustle of silk and shouted alarm. Alaric did not think. He saw Naomi, frozen for half a second near the corridor already filling with smoke, cut off from the nearest exit by the panicking crowd, and he ran toward her instead of toward the door, pulling his coat over both their faces, guiding her through blistering heat and falling ash, past a beam that cracked and fell behind them in a shower of sparks, until they broke into the cold night air together, coughing, alive. His arms locked around her as though he would never willingly let go again. Behind them, in the chaos of the evacuating ballroom, estate officials who had gathered near the staircase read Wren's ledger by lantern light, page by page, and understood, at last, exactly what Lady Constance Vale had spent a year trying to bury beneath forged invoices and a dead man's silence. Lady Constance did not wait to be formally accused. In the confusion of smoke and fleeing guests, she attempted to slip toward the side entrance and her waiting carriage, only to find the magistrate's own men already stationed at the door, summoned earlier that week by Alaric's letter to the city solicitor, arriving that very evening, unfortunate for her timing. You cannot possibly believe the word of a mute child over mine, she said, her composure finally, fully cracking as 2 officials took her by the arms. She stopped being mute the moment she found the courage to speak, Alaric said, Naomi still coughing softly beside him, soot-streaked and trembling but alive. I believe her entirely. I only wish I had believed sooner. Wren, wrapped now in Mrs. Pemberton's shawl at the edge of the chaos, watched the woman who had haunted her nightmares for 11 months being led away into the smoke-hazed night, and for the first time since the accident, she did not feel afraid at all. She only felt quietly and for certain that it was finally truly over, Lady Constance was escorted from Ravenhollow at dawn, her jewels and her composure equally stripped away, taken by the same magistrate she had once tried to summon against Naomi. The evidence, once assembled, the ledger, the handkerchief, the falsified accounts, and the testimony of a child who had finally found her voice left the officials no room for doubt. The east wing bore scorch marks that would take a season to repair, the smell of smoke lingering in the curtains for weeks, but the household, for the first time since the old Duke's death, felt lighter rather than heavier for the damage, as though something poisoned had finally been burned out of the walls along with the drapery. Wren spoke every day after that. Not always easily, not always much. Some mornings only a handful of words, a request for a second helping of bread, a question about why the roses in the garden had not yet bloomed. But enough. Enough to laugh at Mrs. Pemberton's terrible jokes over breakfast. Enough to argue, mildly and with great seriousness, about whether her wooden horse preferred to be called Thunder or Biscuit. Enough to tell Naomi, quietly, one morning in the garden, sunlight falling warm across both their faces for the first time in a long while, "I'm glad you knocked on the right door." Naomi knelt and pulled her into a hug, the same kind the girl had once given her in a drawing room full of strangers, except now there was no fear left in it, only relief and the small, steady weight of a child who had finally learned that trust did not always end in loss. Weeks later, in the same garden, beneath the first green buds of a spring the house had almost forgotten it could have, Alaric found Naomi mending a torn hem on the bench near the roses, exactly as she had been the day he first saw her outside her cottage, needle moving with that same unhurried patience, as though nothing at all had changed and everything had. "I have spent my whole life being told what a duke owes his name," he said, kneeling in the wet grass without any apparent concern for his tailored coat, an act so unlike the man Mrs. Pemberton had described to Naomi weeks ago that the housekeeper, watching discreetly from the terrace, pressed a hand to her mouth. "I would like, for once, to give something to a person instead. To you, to Wren, to whatever we could build together if you would let me." Naomi set down her needle, her eyes bright with something that was not quite disbelief and not quite tears. "I never wanted a title," she said softly. "I never wanted a grand house or silk gowns, or a name that opens every door in the county. I only ever wanted somewhere safe to belong, and someone who would not ask me to be smaller than I am to keep it." "Good," Alaric answered, taking her hand in both of his, "because I am not asking for a duchess. I am asking for a family, the first real one I have had since I was a boy young enough to still believe warmth and strength could live in the same house." And in the quiet garden of a home that had finally stopped holding its breath, Wren watched from the nursery window, smiling for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, as the widow the whole village once called unsuitable became the one person the Thorne family could no longer imagine living without. Not because of what she had, but because of who she had always, quietly, patiently, unshakably been. The wedding, when it came at the end of that spring, was small by the estate's usual standards. No grand masquerade, no chandeliers dripping with borrowed grandeur. Only the village and the household gathered together in the garden where it had all begun. Roses finally in bloom along the very wall Wren had once climbed and torn her dress upon. Mrs. Pemberton cried through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward. Wren, in a new dress the color of new leaves, stood between them both as they spoke their vows, holding one hand from each, refusing, as she so often did now, to let either of them go. Villagers who had once watched a widow mend petticoats by a cottage window now watched her stand at the door of Ravenhollow greeting tenants by name, remembering which child had been ill and which harvest had come in thin, running the estate's household with the same plain, unshakable patience she had once brought to a single basket of mending. And Alaric, who had spent a lifetime believing warmth and strength could not share the same roof, learned instead, slowly and for good, that the strongest thing he had ever done was let himself be changed by a woman who asked nothing of him except honesty, and gave him, in return, a family worth every wall he had finally let fall. True belonging is never about the title you carry or the wealth you were born into. It is about the patience to sit with someone's pain until they trust you enough to speak again. Sometimes the people the world calls unsuitable are the only ones who can actually see us. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away when everyone else already has.